Okay, we had just a great group of speakers there. We're going to go into a panel discussion. I've got a couple of Alaska industry folks on the stage here. Maida Mezdeg, will you raise your hand? And Adelia, thank you. So they're gonna start us out with a couple of questions that I asked them to think through. And Adelia is a new seaweed farmer on Kodiak Island. Maida Mezdeg has been farming oysters out of Juneau here for, about 4 years? I think about 4 years. And Eric Wyatt was actually supposed to join us this morning, but his plane got canceled yesterday, so he's going to be getting in later today. So Maida stepped up for his position. So maybe Maida, can we start with you? Well, first, let me finish. So they're going to kick us off with some questions, and then there's a mic in the center of the room, so the audience is also going to be able to ask questions. But I ask you to consider what the speakers talked about, their background, and specifically target a speaker with your question. We're not going to have one question and go through the entire panel because we'll be done with our time. So just one question to one speaker, please. And we'll start with Maida.
Great. Can you hear me? All right. Sebastian? Hi.
Lucky me.
Yeah. So you talked about gentrification on the farms in your area and how with that you guys provided training for new farmers, and then you found that some areas there was a bit of conflict, not everywhere, but in certain situations, and it really required some social license. What have you guys found to be one of the most effective methods for increasing that or helping to facilitate the growth in communities where mariculture is either new or there's a lot of uncertainty around it?
Great question. I would two-part answer. One is for an individual farmer that's applying for a lease site, we have a farmer training program that we will put them through, and basically it's about community relations. You gotta go sit down with people, break bread with them, have coffee in their kitchen, introduce yourself to them, answer their questions, and take their concerns seriously, even if they sound absolutely ludicrous. Perception is reality, and so if somebody says to you, I don't want your farm there because it's going to attract little purple Martians that are going to land in my backyard, answer the question and don't laugh at them. The second thing is more kind of community-wide, and so we now have a full-time education and communications person. All she does is go out and tell the farmer's story. So short videos, social media, community events. We do a lot of community events where we introduce the farmers to the local community, tasting events. If you're growing something that is directly consumable, take a bunch of it up to your riparian neighbors and give it to them for Christmas and their birthdays. It's earning your stripes, basically. The one thing I will also say is, particularly with the commercial fishing community, help them out. They're going to help you out. You help them out. I'll give you an example. We just had an incident in one of our bays where local fisherman's boat burned, and that was his livelihood. All of our folks banded together. One of them happened to have an extra boat so this guy could fish for the season. They gave him the boat for the season so that he could actually fish and continue to make a living to support his family. So those kinds of things are really important to do at a kind of one-on-one or local community level.
Great, thank you.
Great. Adelia, would you like to go next?
Hi, I'm Adelia. Can everybody hear me? No. Okay. How's that? Better? All right. So I'm a kelp farmer on the west side of Kodiak Island with my husband, and we'll be doing our second harvest next month. So I'm not an expert, and I'm just here to ask questions, and I invite other people to ask questions. Since I'm sitting next to you, John, I will address you, but it's probably a good question for everybody who's sitting up here. I'm very interested in the idea of scale and what you're looking for in terms of producers. What kind of scale you're looking at. Is it something that individual farmers can serve, the needs that you have if you're having a big biorefinery processing plant? Or do we need to look at more of a larger scale kind of, you see the pictures that have been presented from Iceland, especially with those huge boats and everything. And is that something that we're going to be moving towards as an industry? Or is there a place for sort of the individual farmer, kind of like an individual fisherman who sells to a processor? I am a salmon fisherman as well.
So I'll answer that question quickly because I think Eric, you should answer that because I'm sure your organization has dealt with that for decades. And so the first part of my answer is I don't know for sure because we're a new business as well. But we can see in the people that come to talk to us that there are many people who would like to have small farms, and there are some people who want to have very big farms. We always try to say to those people, and we've heard this advice now multiple times, so I'll quickly repeat it. Think about what kind of products you want to make, what lifestyle you want to have, and what are your end markets, and where do you want to sell it. That's super important. There are markets for small boutique farmers, direct to plate, that sort of thing. And you can get a more price, but as Oliver showed, you're going to spend a lot of money on marketing. You need to be aware of that. Whereas if you sell to an industrial buyer, you won't have that kind of cost, but industrial buyers, we're going to need a lower price, and and you can only really give us that lower price if you're doing volume. Now, can small farmers sell to us? I believe so, and I believe they can do that through cooperation, cooperatives where they can sell equipment, sell chopping. There's a whole bunch of ways I think that could happen, and you see that in other industries. The wine industry in France, a lot of that's produced by cooperative, right? Small farms producing things. And that's as much as I know, and a lot of my knowledge is taken from what we can see, but I'm going to hand it over here.
Thank you.
And all I would say is that whatever you can imagine in mariculture is done on land, okay? So, you can have small organic farms, I guess, if there's a market who's willing to pay, 2, 3, 4 times more. Okay?
Okay.
And there you go. But always there needs to be a buyer on the beach, somebody with a bag of money.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
So I did have a follow-up question for you. You were mentioning about, that was a big point I took from your talk is don't produce if you don't have a market. Do you have suggestions of steps? I talk to a lot of people who are interested in becoming a farmer. They hear that I'm a farmer and they're like, oh, I want to do that. And I'm just curious if there's a recommendation on the timing to get in, because we won't be able to have a market if we don't have the product available. But how can we produce the product if there is no market? So aligning that, is a challenge I'm sure everybody is very aware of. And I'm just curious if you have any suggestions.
And that's why we're all in this room.
Yes.
Honestly, it's Saccharina latissima, all right, native to the North Atlantic and the North Pacific. Cultivation efforts on in, Scandinavia and, Iceland, Faroe Islands, the British Isles, Canada, New England, Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, a little bit, and a lot of product development, especially in Norway. So whatever I think we can imagine here is please look to Norway. All right, see what they're doing there, keep your fingers on the pulse. And I think that's good for Alaska anyway, to be good friends with the Nordic countries. And I always like to say that the demand should grow organically. I would love it if a large processor could put up a plant in Alaska that needs 160,000 tons of fresh sugar kelp. I mean, then we can get farming. But that day isn't here yet. Sorry. But
I think
we
it's
have work.
important for us to hear that, you know. It's not bad news, it's just a fact.
The rally. Oliver, you have some input on that?
If I just can add a little bit to what Eric is saying, I mean, I agree with you that it's very important that we have a market before we start cultivation or farming. But you can't scale up from having nothing to having a lot from day to day. It takes time to scale up. It takes time to learn what works and what doesn't work. So I think it is possible today to start farming at a scale like you have done in Prince Sound and other places, both here in Alaska and what we also can see in Europe and, as Eric says, especially in Scandinavia. But then you have to be conscious about what are the market you are serving with the scale you are doing now. And I think, and that is possible. It's just you have to be very conscious about that. And if you forget the market, then you're out of business. That sounds very simple also. But the other thing is then that the co-op thing, I mean, if like Oceanium, I really hope that they will succeed in what they're doing, because they'll be asking for quantities that most farmers that I know of, that's more than what individually can provide. Mm-hmm. But then the idea of co-op should come to life. And we have seen that in agriculture as well. That this is how you build a successful agriculture in dairy and so on. So I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel that much. I mean, look at what worked in dairy for the last 100, 150 years in terms of co-op systems. A lot of that can be replicated, I think, in seaweed farming. And we have to start in order to be able to scale when Oceanium and others, hopefully, will ask for thousands of tons of Saccharina and other species that you can deliver here in Alaska especially.
Thank you. Okay, and I think not just land-based farmers, but Alaska's salmon industry, actually salmon fishing industry, has an interesting example of thousands of small fishermen who deliver in a business relationship with larger processors. And sometimes there's co-ops, and sometimes it's just a business-to-business relationship that evolves. And so, you know, those are also models that mariculture in Alaska may follow and may not. I have a question to switch from seaweed. So it was texted to me from Eric. So he's going to be with us even though he's not here. And I'm going to give it to John Croman. Eric says summer die-offs of oysters in Washington, BC, and Oregon that you mentioned have increased demand for Alaska oysters. So do you think this trend will continue? And what is your company doing to respond?
This is good news. So I was insanely jealous that the governor's comment about permitting was the whole Alaska-Washington vibe. It was 100% accurate. So, I mean, I guess I will duck the question by pointing out it's not a zero-sum game. I think in the short term, there is an opportunity for whoever can produce healthy, quality-produced oysters to the half-shell market. I mean, there is no question about that. There are and Washington has suffered from other disruptions. There was a regulatory decision that they said took a bad situation and worse, that could not have been a worse symbiotic effect with COVID, a devastating effect on shellfish growers, at a time when she said, don't move. So the long story short is, I think the answer is there will be demand for Alaska's oysters. I don't think I would link that to concerns over supply of Washington oysters, except for the sort of tectonic effect of climate. And that will be a problem for the rest of our lives. And to the extent that there are solutions, there is research being done on the triploid mortalities and trying to understand exactly what triggered them. For sure, our company's core mission, our core purpose is resilience in the face of these threats, and the science that Joss and Dennis have developed absolutely gives us great optimism that that will be a solution. It's a multi-year process, but we are all in a time of adaptation. So I think that I would not, don't want to put the wrong words, I would not view it as an opportunistic tragedy emerging in Washington with heat domes. I would view this as a problem for everyone, and that to the extent Alaska's waters won't warm as faster, okay, but it's a rising tide kind of situation where we just need more resilient animals.
Okay, anyone in the audience have a question? It looks like maybe Ginny is coming to the mic.
Hey everybody, my name's Ginny Eckert. I'm at the university and with Alaska Sea Grant. My question is for Sebastian. So I was really interested in your small little mini farm example that you could get a permit in a month. Gosh, there's so many people that would be interested in that here. So who are those people? Like, is this a lawyer that does this in his backyard? Or, you know, who are these people that are getting these small farms? And then maybe a follow-up that's sort of related to getting people started is that in oyster farming here in Alaska, capital is really hard because there's such a long duration between when you start and when you can sell a product that there's not enough capital. So does that little entry help you, or is that an entirely different group of people that are pursuing those small permits? And maybe this is two questions.
Okay. So the who is interesting. I would say the majority of people who are applying for LPAs right now are probably coming out of the commercial fishing sector, and they're doing it because it's a way for them to try aquaculture without incurring a lot of capital risk and even site risk. The second group of people who are doing it are what I would term kind of hipster foodies. They're folks who want to produce local food. They think it's really cool. And I will tell you, and I mean no offense by this to anybody, but the attrition rate in the second group is much higher than the attrition rate in the first group. It ain't nearly as fun as you think it is. And so we rub the shine off pretty quickly. I think the good part about that program is that it has caused farms to spread all along the coast. So communities that didn't have farms in them before now have farms in them. They're seeing what farming is. The bad side of that program, it has caused farms to spread all over the coast, and people who've never seen a farm suddenly are concerned about what a farm is and don't want to necessarily look at it. So it's actually, ironically, I would say, in some instances, heightened the social conflict around the sector. But the other good thing about that system is, and this is something I think that, I don't know whether you run into this in Alaska or not, but fear of the unknown. People have an image about what a farm might or might not be, and until they actually see one and experience a farmer, get to know a farmer, they often have a very ill-conceived notion around what it is. And what we have found, interestingly, is we have a renewal cycle on our farms. The LPAs are annual permits, so you have to apply for them every year. But there's a natural business development cycle that comes out of those LPAs where the people who are successful begin to then apply for standard leases. So they scale up. And when they go through that, you apply for a standard lease. And originally, the tenure of a standard lease in Maine was 10 years. We got it changed to 20 years because when you're talking about building a company and your license is only 10 years long, it's hard to raise capital. And this gets to your second question. It's also, you're going to be charged higher interest rate. When you go to buy a house and you go for a 10-year mortgage, you have to pay a different interest rate than if you go for a 30-year mortgage, right? So it's exactly the same in financing in aquaculture. And so by lengthening the license lengths, we actually achieved a couple things. But the reason I talk about the renewals is because even on the most controversial lease applications that we've had in Maine, where we have literally had hearings that have gone on for days, where we have had hundreds of people testify in opposition because they've been kind of whipped up by a hired gun locally whose job is to help form local groups to oppose an application. When those leases come up for renewal, we've never had a lease that's had opposition to that renewal. So what does that tell you? It tells you that once you get a farm into a community, and if they operate responsibly, and that's important, people get to know it, it becomes the neighborhood farm, and that social license really goes away as an issue. Now, if you have an irresponsible operator, that's a different situation. We have literally, in our association, we have kicked 2 farmers out of our membership association, and that's something that a membership association does not do lightly, because we are funded solely by membership dues, right? We don't get money from the government. We don't get, stuff like that. So we rely on the fact that our members see value in the membership and are willing to pay those dues. For us to kick somebody out from an association is a big deal. And the reason we did was because they weren't complying with our best management practices. And we were probably some of the first farmers in the world to come up with best management practices that were then third-party audited. Long before ASC came along, long before BAP came along, we were developing BMPs in the early 90s that were then being certified externally by external auditors. And we took that very seriously from a membership association, and we have, as I said, we've kicked people out because they were out of compliance with the BMPs.
Super interesting. Any more questions from the audience? Yeah, please step up to the mic.
How's it going? My question's for Oliver. You mentioned the importance of the 24 hours to processing after you harvest the seaweed. The logistics in Alaska are pretty difficult. Has there been limiting factors that caused you to not be able to put farms in areas? And what are the things that you've done to help break through those limiting factors? Is like chilling, freezing, and what have you found be the most successful?
Yeah, it's a very, very relevant question. There are basically, the way I look at it, 3 ways of making the seaweed storage stable, fresh seaweed storage stable. You can dry it, you can freeze it, or you can ensile it, or that's also what we call fermentation. And we do all 3 in the Faroe Islands, but I don't like to dry in the Faroes because the electricity cost is too high. It's the same with a frozen product. It's expensive to keep on storage. So what we did 3-4 years ago was really to dig into fermentation. How can we do to make the seaweed storage stable just by using bacteria and no energy? And that's what we are doing today. So we found out, and through that research, we also found that when you ferment seaweed, and this is Saccharina latissima, you break and you use an inoculum for that fermentation process. You will break down the fibers in the seaweed, make it more digestible, and it then turned out through the research we have done, especially on livestock, that we can have a product that has both a prebiotic and a probiotic functionality on the microbiome. And that's what we are selling. So we have a storage stable technology that you can apply everywhere in Alaska, because the way to make the seaweed storage stable within 24 hours with this method doesn't require a large facility or a high capex to do it. It requires that you know what you're doing. But you can do that in basically, I would claim, most of the harbor facilities I've seen here. And I have been traveling a bit with Julie around Alaska. So that is definitely a recommendable way to do it. If you are lucky that you are at a location where, for instance, geothermal is available, or sustainable power from wind turbines or other, or by other means, that you have I would say, sustainable supply of energy source that is inexpensive, then you can dry it. Because at some point you would like to dry your product. Because if you sell to the industry, most industry commodities, they do want a dried product to work with, because that's easier to deal with in any ways. So when I look at it, it's a primary process. You can make a storage stable with ensiling, but then you would like to move it to a place where you can do value adding function, and that often ends up with a drying process. But that means that you can do primary process in one location and then have a hub where you can do secondary process. And in Alaska, based on what I've seen, all that's possible. But that's a longer discussion. But I hope I have answered your question with a very, very long answer.
And I would note that on the AFDF table out there, there's an actual study that I'm never going to stop calling you McDowell. McKinley Research Group did for us, looking at like feasibility of hubs for seaweed processing in Alaska in different communities. So kind of analyzing the numbers and number of farmers nearby, things like that. Good stuff. If no one's running to the mic, yeah, please come to the mic. Mate, I'm going to get you next after this question.
Hey, everybody. I'm Danielle Blacklock from NOAA Fisheries in Washington, D.C.
Thanks for coming.
Oh, thank you. It's good to be in Alaska again. My question for the panel is a couple of things that I've heard a bunch of folks talk about are either cooperatives for infrastructure, hubs for processing, and also the need for product development. And my question is, what do you think the role of government in those things are and the role of public-private partnerships should be? Thanks.
Do you have a speaker that you'd like to target with that?
All of them.
All of them.
We actually have a CRADA with NOAA, Northwest Fisheries Science Center folks. I have to say, after 30 years in the private sector, it was a kind of a culturally revealing experience to negotiate an agreement with the government, but it all ended well, except for COVID coming and shutting the facility down when you're trying to keep organisms alive. I think it's a great opportunity, and I think people see the clarity around it. I mean, obviously, we'd love the government to write checks. That's good. But there is a higher level research opportunity there that I think, at least in our industry, is there. I mean, there's a huge interest in seeing, at least in Washington State, I think, a greater capacity scientifically at NOAA. There is, I think we have the salmon legacy, which is critically important, but there's an opportunity, at least in our world, to look at the basic science around genetics. There's a scientist there. So I think that's terrific. I think, and I've offered this, but we can advocate with legislators for budget in ways you can't. And so we're happy to do that. I mean, and so the phrase public-private partnership is a little vague, but scientific resource policy influence cash from NOAA and commercialization opportunities, real-world relationships with producers and ultimately into the market. I'm encouraged to see those things kind of align, but it's got to be focused on some real outcomes. So shellfish survival would be a good outcome. I think product development in seaweed would be a good outcome, because ultimately you're looking at the government helping to front load some of the risk and cost, particularly on the earlier stages of the R&D sort of ladder. But I think focus on an outcome from an industry perspective is the way I've tried to organize it.
Did anyone else want to address that? Oliver, go ahead.
I think, first of all, to have the permits in place and the, I don't know if I can call it, or use the word spatial planning, or to allocate so that you can actually have the space in the ocean you need in order to do cultivation. That's one important part of the government, where the government can play a role. But when it comes to development of an industry that we are talking about here, because I always find seaweed cultivation, I find it difficult to call it industry because it's so nascent. It's more on endeavors of very enthusiastic entrepreneurs that we are trying to build something. And I think the combination of, there are three income sources as I see it for building that, and that is grants, investors, and customers. And the last one is clearly the most sustainable in the long run. But in the short run, if you can have well-suited grants that can enable a graduate scale-up of the biomass production. So we are able to pay So those who do cultivation are able to get a price that they can actually pay their cost for doing the cultivation. You saw my numbers, and there is a pathway to come down on that price level from where we are today, and to come to a cost level that is competitive. But grants in itself is not the solution. So grants have to be dependent on that you actually do research and development work, and selective breeding is one part here. And I'm not fully into all the regulations here in Alaska, but my understanding is that that's a bit difficult. And if that can't happen, I can't see how you can become or how mariculture in Alaska can become competitive, because we have seen in Asia they have increased yield by up to 200% through selective breeding. So that is a very important component in making the industry competitive. So I think it's a mix, but of different methods. But having a close dialogue with the authorities, as a conference here is an example on, is definitely a very important part. And in ocean rainforest, we would not have been able to do what we do today unless we had a very close collaboration with the research environment, and being good at, or being fortunate in receiving some of the grants we have to do most of the high risk or the de-risk some of the activities we have done. And then, of course, that we now are getting investors on board and making us able to expand our business on pure commercial terms.
So I just want to put in a plug right now for NOAA is soliciting input on the outline of a strategic plan for aquaculture economic development. Comments are due on Friday of this week. So if you get on the internet, you can Google that up and see what they're planning and submit comments if you have any ideas of better ways to use government funds to do what you want to do.
I
Yep,
just wanted
Sebastian.
to echo
John
what
first,
Oliver-
then Sebastian.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Oliver said about grants. We could not have raised the money from investors we raised without grant money, because you can't make the numbers work to invest and do the R&D work, which is already highly speculative, without there being some non-dilutive capital. But government should also expect that they get something out of that. And what they get is learnings that get shared with the wider community. So that's very important. And if you think about it, if that can be what we learn with just our project can be shared with a lot of people, then they can get a real payback on that grant money in terms of building up the industry. So it shouldn't just be a one-way thing on the grants, but they are hugely important, and it can go to solving a lot of those community shared problems where those learnings need to be figured out.
Sebastian?
Yeah, so I'm going to take a slightly different take on this and say that, and just so fair disclosure, our group has been pushing for that National Economic Development Plan for a long time, as Danielle knows. And the reason is because that's what our competitors in other countries have done for years, and they have been able to harness the capacity in the research community as well as in the government financial resources, if you will, to strategically develop components in the sector. But I think we also have to be, and we have done this in this country, I would argue the history of grant writing in the United States of America compared to some of our competitors in other countries has been that we have spent an awful lot of money on either species or technologies which probably are not necessarily commercially relevant. And so you have to be, I think, very careful to not allow grant monies to distort the marketplace from an investor point of view to the point where you're using precious resources on things which frankly will never kind of come to commercial fruition. And this goes back to the idea of you got to start with the market. You got to start with the product that you can sell and work your way back from there from a technological challenges point of view. That's not to say that there won't be leaps that happen from a technology point of view that are the result of government research funds. There will be and there have been, but I completely agree that I think the real role for governments are funding for long-term kind of key bottleneck research points like breeding programs, for example, where an individual company really has a hard time raising the capital to do a 10 or 15 or 20-year selective breeding program where a government probably can. That was, in fact, the genesis of the salmon industry in Norway, was a partnership between the private sector and the public sector driving the breeding program under the direction of a dairy geneticist, ironically, right? It was a dairy geneticist that started that government breeding program. That's why they have, it's in part why they have as successful a salmon industry as they do, was because it was this public-private, but it was focused on long-term challenges that had a direct outcome, as you alluded to earlier, as opposed to kind of more general, pure research kind of stuff.
Just one other thing, not to underestimate the importance of cash, but buildings and equipment are also expensive, and spreading that cost over, particularly as John was saying, earlier stage companies, is death. So one nice development is there's, I think it's a done deal, probably know Danielle, a laboratory at Manchester that's devoted to OA research on a variety of species. And so we're excited because as we develop oysters that for OA resistance, there is a facility there. I mean, as opposed to, I'm hopeful we won't have to spend a lot of money to use it. There will be complementary science that we develop, much of it publishable. So this notion of the information exchange is really critical. But government facilities and equipment are worth a ton, even if you have to rent them on a use basis, as opposed to a startup saying, gosh, we can't figure out how to make an OA-resistant oyster without a $5 million building. You'd be laughed out of every investment conversation. So cooperation around outcomes, but particularly with physical resources, is huge. And so that OA, which I believe is part of the salmon strategy, is a really big deal. So we're hopeful that if we get past COVID, that we can actually start the research process that will productize that finding that's already there in the evidence from what hybrids can do. So that buildings, test tubes, pumps, those are good too. So,
Maida, next.
So I have a three-part question. John, the first two are for you. As Julie mentioned, I have an oyster farm, and I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on the Pacific oyster mortality syndrome and tell us about that. And then also, looking at solutions for that, you had talked about the hybrid oyster that's specifically geared towards Alaska. I'm curious about what the cost of production looks like and if I need to be budgeting for that now. And then in third part, Eric, I'm curious about, as we look at growing this industry and we know that there's some problems on the horizon, metaphorically, I don't want to be stuck on a beach with 2 years of dried seaweed and nobody to sell it to. I don't want to have a farm full of oysters. And you talked about one of the most important things that you've worked on trying to address is industry involvement as we work towards growing this industry, right? And what are some of the most effective ways that we can work together with industry to help effectively grow? We have a really small group of farmers in Alaska right now, and it does seem like everybody's trying to work together, but what are the things that you've seen to create the greatest amount of success so we're not stuck sitting on a beach? So it's kind of a three-part in two different directions, but all kind of coming together.
Try to be unusually concise, given my legal heritage. So bad news and good news. Bad news is POMS is a herpes virus that has had a catastrophic impact in Australia and New Zealand and in France over the years. It comes in different flavors, some more virulent than others. There's a non-virulent strain up in Tamales Bay in Northern California where there's a lot of research being done. There was a horrific period a couple of years ago, and it was detected in a Flupsy in the port of San Diego, and the industry nearly came to a stop because whenever there's a very robust infrastructure on disease management and animals crossing state lines, so literally people were talking about oysters not moving anywhere, including from the hatcheries. We got past that, and but the bottom line is that it appears to be something that shows up when it does. There's a hypothesis that it might be triggered by warmer water. Where it came from, there's some theorizing that it is from ballast water that came in. But it's a really, really big risk that truly does keep people up at night. So the good news is, sales pitch, the science says that there are genetic lines that are resistant to the virus. We think crossbreeding is one strategy that will isolate them over time. We had a small grant from, it was NOAA, I think, to work on this, and so kind of got out of the gate with that. So it's a race. So that's the good news. The better news is no, our business model is I would not think you should be budgeting for that. I think that's part of the fundamental value proposition that we want to develop better brood stock to supply to the hatcheries that will ultimately serve this industry, and then the gazillions of seed that come out of those animals would be sold at commodity prices. But if they are demonstrably better at harvest, we want a little piece of the action. And if they happen to live because of they're not getting palms, fine. So yeah, I wouldn't worry about the budget right now.
Thank you.
In my work, I go to locations. If I need more seaweed, I'm coming there. I've already done my site selection. I've, socioeconomics, environmental, logistics. So I know, yeah, that's where I'd like to see a new supply of farm seaweed. Same thing with some of the fish seaweeds. I will go to a place because I know that's where it's native, and socioeconomics work out, logistics work out. So I'm not really a big help with your question because I go with a market demand. However, I'm here to help. So, my feeling would be that, you're on a small scale now. I don't know if you're doing your own processing and marketing, and if that's working out for you, you got to keep at it. And it'll just make sense whether a couple of farms need to get together and share one processing facility and a marketing effort. I'd have to look at each individual situation to give a good answer to that situation.
All right.
Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah, I do my best.
Okay, I think we got 2 minutes left. So one more question for the audience? Is that a question coming?
Most inquisitive audience I've ever seen.
I'm surprised that there isn't more people rushing the mic.
I am Trace Taylor. I'm a student at the University of Alaska Southeast, and my question is for Oliver. There's been a lot of talk about identifying your target market today, and I was wondering if when Nordic Seaweed was starting, what their target market was, and if you've seen changes to that market and what that change looks like over time. Thank you.
So to understand, so you asked me what our original target market was?
Yeah, so what was your original market, and has that changed?
It's a very good, the idea about ocean rainforests came in 2007, and at that point, it was basically that we wanted to take up CO2 from the ocean in the around the Faroe Islands and make a contribution to mitigating climate change. That was fundamentally the idea. And then we would like to grow seaweed and use it to produce bioethanol. And then we found out after a couple of years that would never take off because we couldn't compete with other energy sources. Then actually I met DuPont, and they said, well, if you can cultivate Hyperborea, then we can take whatever you can produce. At a price. At a price, yeah, of course. But I knew very little about what I'm talking about today. So we started, and actually the first trials I did was for Hyperborea, Laminaria Hyperborea.
And how fast did that stipe grow?
Exactly, and it takes 4 to 5 years to grow before it's useful. Huh? So I learned the hard way that the target market for us was food, We have had many customers that have bought the dried seaweed from us, made food products. Unfortunately, I don't see the traction I would like to see in the supermarkets. People tend to buy it once. It's a bit expensive, so they put it back in the cupboard and say, it's so expensive, I don't want to use it now. And then it gets all the last date, and they don't buy it again. I mean, that's what I've seen, unfortunately, for many products. However, here in Juneau, you have one producer who produces a very tasty material, and the first thing I bought when I came to Juneau was barnacle sauce and pesto, or the sauce you have, the dip. That's a very tasty product, and this is the thing. When you produce products from seaweed, food products, they have to be tasty. It's too acquired taste, it doesn't sell a lot. But then I came to a conclusion a couple of years ago. I need somebody who can consume the seaweed product every day. And today we sell it to piglets, and they consume it every day.
Well, Oliver, I've seen you traveling. You also consume it every day, right?
Yes. Oh, of course. I actually, because I'm waiting for the fermented food product to be launched later this year. So actually every morning I have a tablespoon of pig feed that is fermented with my yogurt. It doesn't sound very nice, but everything we produce is food grade, so I can eat it. And I use that as a kind of a muesli with my yogurt every morning to keep my gut happy, because the bacteria, they need the fibers. We eat too much food with too little bacteria, too little fiber, actually also too little bacteria, but too little fiber in most of the food we eat. This is what seaweed can do for all of us in here. We can really improve our gut system, make our gut bacteria happy, and that has a direct impact on our brain or our general immune system. So just go for it.
That was a really good closing line. And if you still have questions, come grab these guys during lunch.